Okay, time to introduce our keynote session. Teo You Yenn is Associate Professor and Provost Chair in Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Social Inequality, CSSI, at NTU. Her previous book, This is What Inequality Looks Like, I think made her a household name. She disagrees, but I think made her a household name. And she just released a new one called Unease, about Singaporean family life, which is about as bland a description as I can give for the next book. But that's what the keynote is about, so I'm not going to preempt it. Both books apparently are at the top of the charts right now. And I would say, just personally, the past 2 decades, inequality has sort of risen up the agenda in many societies across the world. I'd say few have done as much as you to raise the consciousness of their own societies. So thanks very much. And quick editorial disclosure, You Yenn is also one of Jom's original 4 endorsers, so I just had to put that out there. Not the reason we've invited her today. Pooja Bhandari, thanks also for joining us. Pooja will be the discussant for You Yenn, is the founder of EveryChild.SG, a non-profit movement to prioritize child well-being in Singapore. She also consults on impact and special projects for AWA, AWA, A-W-W-A, a large multi-service charity. They've done wonderful work around, a bunch of things, but the study I remember is around unconditional cash transfers, or what happens when you give low-income people money with no strings attached. Prior to that, Pooja spent 6 years with our government at the Ministry of Social and Family Development. Yeah, a lot more to say, but in a similar vein to You Yenn, I'd say that few have done as much here to raise our awareness about children's well-being. So thanks a lot, Pooja. And with that, I'd like to invite you both to the stage.
Thanks, Sudhir. Maybe we'll just dive straight into it. You Yenn, if you want to start us off by sharing what Unease is about and the context that got you started.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sudhir, for the... Where did Sudhir go so fast? Oh, okay. Thank you, Sudhir. The lights are really bright here, so I can't see everyone that clearly. Thank you, Sudhir, for that generous introduction, and to the whole team at Jom, who've been so supportive of my work, and especially of Unease. This book is non-fiction. It is built on academic research. It is not a self-help book or a book about how to make more money. And it's quite critical of the status quo. It's published by a small local press. So a book like this needs many, many champions and word of mouth to travel. For it to travel all the way to the top of the bestseller list, I think is pretty astonishing. And I'm very grateful for the support of readers, of booksellers, and groups like Jom. And in the audience, if you're one of those people who has been telling anyone who will listen about this book, who's been posting on social media, buying it to give to people, please know that I see you and I appreciate you. I hope you all take pride and take credit for the book's success so far. Thank you very much. So I know probably a bunch of you in the audience have already read the book, but there are also probably many who have not. So in the interest of creating some common ground so that everyone can be part of the conversation today, let me just give a brief introduction. So Unease focuses on the everyday lives of parents with work and care responsibilities. And I pose the puzzle of why, in this world-class, everything high-ranking global city, there seems to be a gap between ideal and reality. Why, if this is such a pro-family place, with such excellent childcare and education systems in place, why do parents seem so uneasy? To answer the question, the book goes into a lot of nitty-gritty of ordinary people's everyday lives. And really, when I started the project, I thought of this as sort of a project on the interior of life in families. And I wanted to take seriously the texture of the everyday so that I can go beyond the usual stories that Singaporean parents are too kiasu, that what they have are problems with their attitudes, and they should just change their mindsets and chill. As I go into this nitty-gritty of everyday lives, I do two broad things. One, I explore the relationships between the structural and the cultural. By this, I mean that I pay attention to how institutionalized processes, rules, policies, what we call the structural, and meaning systems, beliefs, values, habits, norms, what we call the cultural, how the structural and cultural interact. And doing this, I aim to show that no one lives in a social vacuum. The choices people make, the practices they can take, are very deeply shaped by social conditions. When it comes to work and family, social policies are especially consequential. So that's the first broad thing I do, is to explore the relationship between the cultural and the structural. The second broad thing I do as I explore the nitty-gritty of everyday life is to look at how inequality matters, not as an abstract idea, but as a concrete part of daily reality. I explore how, as parents figure out what childcare centers or schools to enroll their children in, or as they interact with schools about their kids' results, how they can see and feel the logic of the game in Singapore. And the logic of the game centers on competition and sorting, on hierarchy and unequal worth. The reality of income and wealth inequality, including its long-term implications for well-being, are very palpable to parents. So they're not abstractions, they're in the everyday. So these things, the interactions between the structural and cultural, the salience of inequality, I think these things help us explain why people parent and live family lives the way they do. They offer us counter-explanations to challenge the stereotypes that this is about individuals and about kiasu mindsets. I offer a critique of the state's claims to being pro-family, and I argue that over the past decades, it has taken an approach toward family that has been more concerned about boundary making and control than about meeting the needs of changing families. Although the book's empirical subjects are working parents, I'm very interested in thinking about life in Singapore society more broadly. So I offer an analysis of the values we valorize through our collective practices and the virtues we have neglected to develop in the same process. Those parts of the book which come toward, I guess, the last two chapters especially, these parts of the book that really are starting to talk more about the broad values and the broader political culture in Singapore. These parts of the book are most difficult for me to talk about at events like these. This is because a book allows for a slow and kind of gradual meeting of consciousness, mine and the readers, right? And it's a bit harder to replicate in live conversation. So when I summarize my points like these, I think to my own ear, they sound like it's too audacious and too much of a leap if you haven't come with me on the journey through the book. So I hope those of you who haven't read the book yet won't be put off too much by this description. Give the book a chance. See if it makes sense to you, by the end of the book. Ultimately, I hope readers of the book will see that we need to take seriously the broad costs of inequality to everyone in society, to our shared values. And I hope the book will also leave readers energized and motivated to want to partake in conversations about what a good society is and what actions we need to take to bring it into reality. So over the past month, I was just talking to Pooja and Sudhir earlier that, I'm doing about a dozen or so events and podcasts over this kind of couple weeks period. And I'm now about 2/3 of the way done, I just have a few more to do. And so I've had several opportunities to meet people, different audiences, to discuss the book. And I have felt very deeply the value of coming together face to face to discuss issues and problems that concern us as a society. part of what the events are about is to help us deepen understanding and knowledge about learning things. Of course, as a teacher, I'm very interested in that. But I'm also coming to see that another part of what we gain from gathering goes beyond this kind of knowledge accumulation of that sort, and has to do with how we can see each other better when we have the opportunity to be in the same room where different people are speaking, sharing their experiences and views and expertise. And in a diverse society where we do have different views and sometimes clashing interests, seeing and recognizing one another is really crucial, I think, to building a good society. What is a good society? I think at the very basic level, I think a good society is one in which, despite our differences, we can agree that everyone should be able to live with dignity and belonging. So over the past weeks, I felt a tremendous sense of honor and gratitude that my book can be a pretext, a vehicle, a kind of opportunity for connecting and recognizing one another. So thank you again, Jom, for inviting me today to be here, and to Pooja for agreeing to be in conversation with me. Thanks to everyone who's here today to speak this afternoon, and everyone else also who's made time to be here to be part of the audience. I think these opportunities for us to gather are still relatively rare, and they are very precious. And part of our work must be to make them more common over time by taking seriously every opportunity that we do have. I'm looking forward to participating in conversations, to being part of this process, to seeing and recognizing each other just a little more. Thank you.
Thanks, Yo Yenn. Can you hear fine, right? My main reaction to this book was really gratitude on behalf of all the parents of Singapore. I think we've been accused for so long of driving this arms race when actually we don't really have much choice, even for those who are fairly well off. So unless you're willing to move your child, which some people do, move your child out in primary 5, primary 6, go to Thailand or Bali or Australia for a couple of years, or you get an exemption for your child because they have learning needs. Beyond that, you're pretty much stuck in this rat race. And this widespread unease, which is the title of the book, was actually one of the main driving reasons I started EveryChild.SG. Of course, I spoke to a lot of people across class lines, not as much as Yo Yenn would have in a full-fledged book, but I did do my homework, and I felt this unease in all the conversations where people feel there is one thing that they should be doing for their children, yet they are being driven to do something else. I think Yo Yenn uses sociology to describe this. For EveryChild.SG, we've used game theory because my background is in economics. And you know, when we stack rank children at the early age of 12 at PSLE, of course, you know, it keeps the academic standards up, keeps everyone on their toes. In that sense, we've done well with education. But it also sets up a zero-sum game, right? For every child who does better at PSLE, some other child has to do worse, because kids are stack ranked by their results and then allocated to secondary schools. So the secondary schools are also essentially stack ranked, and everyone knows where the standing is. And in other countries where it may be, you know, only maybe the children who are really good academically or the parents who are really well off who choose to compete in this way at such a young age. In Singapore, we see that everyone has to do that, because even if your child is average, he's competing with other average children for that average secondary school placement. So changing individual parent mindsets, I think, is important. We do accept our role in this rat race, but I think there's also this underlying context and structural conditions which Yo Yenn has brought out so well in her book. If we don't tackle those, then it's like, you know, it's the other important half of the solution that we have not really tackled. Another thing that convinced me to start EveryChild.SG was also related to Yo Yenn. I think you don't know this story. This was pre-COVID, and I was going around asking people, hey, if all of us parents feel this way, and we've all been talking about the education system for so long and the need for change, why hasn't anything changed? And a friend of mine was like, oh, I know You Yenn, I can get us a meeting. And so we had half an hour with you. This was pre-COVID. And one of the things you said that really stuck for me was that we don't actually have a parent lobby in Singapore. Parents are not organized, right? So there's a lot of divide and conquer that, people can do, whether it's at the level of individual class teacher talking to a parent, or the school principal, or even, MOE in general. And that really convinced me, okay, then maybe if, what I think needs to be said is something other parents also believe and share, then let's try and put it out in a unified way in one place on the internet and then take it from there. So that was actually the origin of EveryChild.SG. So thank you for that as well. I'll start with my first question for you. In the book, I think you noted a lot of parents give this kind of reaction where they say like, no choice lah, and you call it something more chim, which is ethical agency. So could you explain what that means, how it relates to this unease, and also maybe how it makes it harder then to advocate for policy change?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for those comments, Pooja. And I do remember meeting you. I do remember that. So I think it's important to first articulate that humans are very much capable and indeed need value orientations. Right? That means we have space for, and we indeed need considerations of what is right and wrong and what is good or bad. I think this is actually at the core of what makes us human, our capacity to do that, to have value orientations and to want to try to act according to our value orientations. But because we live in society, our ability to bring into practice those value orientations are not entirely up to us. And so social conditions really matter. I think those are kind of the two kind of main points I'm trying to make in the book, right? That one, value orientations really are indeed very important to people. And two, that how we can bring what we think is right with our actions, align with our actions, sometimes it's out of our hands, depends on the social conditions we're in. So parents are uneasy, and people, I think, in general are uneasy precisely because there is a gap between what they think is right to do and what they feel they have to do. Yeah? And in the book, I'm trying to showcase that gap, primarily through looking at parenting and through looking at the kind of choices parents feel they can make, especially when it comes to children's education. So feeling like they feel sorry for their kids, they feel like kids should have more time to play, they feel like this competition and this relentlessness in sort of focus on schooling is not necessarily right for children, and yet feeling like, but I have no choice, I have to give them tuition, or I have to supervise them in homework. I feel like I also have to do all this because otherwise, I could also be in some ways not living up to my duty as a parent. So I think that's why I call it sort of ethical agency, the sense that not just that people feel like they don't have a choice, but that this lack of choice is something pretty profound because it gets to, this sense that they cannot act according to their values.
Yeah. There's another part of your book that maybe you could explore more for us. So you coined this phrase, education as care labor, I think, before this book. But this book is where I really felt it come to life, including its impact on family life, gender norms, regardless of, people's socioeconomic status. We've also seen the latest news on our total fertility rate. It's like hit a new low, 0.87. If you actually look at the graph, it's a bit scary because it's not a gradual decline. It kind of goes like this, and then suddenly the 0.87 is like, it's angling down towards zero. at breakneck speed. How do you think this burden on families plays into our declining TFR? And then, could we go so far as to call it the primary driver, perhaps?
Yeah. So the education as care labor paper was a paper I wrote before I wrote this book. So in many ways, writing that paper sort of clarified for me, right, that the idea that when we think about care in the contemporary context, and certainly in Singapore, we really need to think beyond sort of changing diapers or feeding babies and bathing and all of those things that especially in the literature when we think about care of children, that's kind of where a lot of the attention is, and that's why a lot of the attention is on childcare facilities or the various institutional kind of things that need to be set up in order for people to care for young children. And what I found when I talked to parents was that in some ways care extends well beyond that, and that indeed when children get into school age, a lot of the burden of care actually becomes even more salient to parents. And interestingly, those forms of care of children's education are not so easily outsourced. And I think that's quite important to pay attention to as well. So where care for children, people, I think parents still feel like, well, a lot of this work we can outsource, quote unquote, outsource to grandparents or to domestic workers. When it comes to education, they really feel it more strongly as their work. And this is particularly so for mothers. Yeah. And so that does mean that, when we think about care, it really extends for a much more prolonged period, and also that it requires really a wide range of labor, right? Forms of labor to do. I think circling back to your question about whether this ties in with the TFR, I suppose part of this way of living is now very obvious to people, even if they're not parents. Yeah, that broadly, culturally, as a society, we are very aware that these are the contours of life in Singapore, or these are the contours of parenting in Singapore, and this is the life one can expect, right? And also for a lot of the young people now who are making fertility decisions, in some ways they grew up in these families where this is the dynamic, right? So I think it certainly, and they grew up also in this kind of education system where they are the ones who went through a pretty punishing sort of education system. So I think it must have a broad effect, right, in shaping how people think about their decisions, as they are growing up, whether it's marriage or partnership or children, and they do. I think they are aware of these various demands that they face when they make these decisions, and so I'm sure it does play into part of what they sort of think about when they're making those decisions. I think. So we can think of education, I think, as a major factor, but I would say it's not disconnected from all the other things, of course, right? That work and the sense of precarity people feel around work in contemporary times, this sense that there is no free lunch and that everything you need, you must ensure that you must be able to generate through some sort of market activity. I think those are the kinds of things that people are grappling with when they're thinking about their futures.
I am cautiously optimistic, maybe that we may begin to see some change. Two reasons. One is that I think this, if I'm not wrong, so this may need to be fact-checked, I think this is the first time that the government committee looking at the TFR issue actually has married women with children on it. So that's great, yeah. And the second is our education minister Desmond Lee also promised to look into the education arms race. Like they have called it the arms race. So I think there is maybe that growing broad recognition that this is something as a society we need to delve into more seriously. So fingers crossed, yeah. In the book, you make the link between neoliberal capitalism, how it's driving the growing inequality, and a cultural acceptance of hierarchy, unequal access, unequal worth. And a lot of that starts as early as preschool, but then it really gets going with PSLE and then what follows after that. Perhaps you could help us understand how this level of inequality and acceptance of hierarchy in our daily lives, it impacts everyone, not just parents and children, and not just those at the lower end of the income scale.
So first, I mean, I think that in this book, I really rely on a lot of the scholarship that kind of tracks the rise of neoliberal capitalism in the 1970s and then through the last couple of decades, and the kinds of effects the kind of neoliberal orthodoxy, ideas around neoliberal capitalism and the orthodoxy around that, how that has shaped states and societies, right? And that scholarship is very helpful for us, I think, to see how multiple areas of life, of human life, and arguably almost all areas of human life have really been very deeply marketized, yeah? Such that there has been a real reduction of human value to market value, or a real equation of human value with market value. And along with that, also a kind of state-society relations that has evolved, in which the state's role, especially as it pertains to the provision of goods or the meeting of needs, has become very residual, right? So that welfare and the notion of welfare states or the notion of public goods has really become a thing that's very diminished, almost seen as like, this is a bad thing, yeah. And public spending is viewed with some level of suspicion. I mean, there are specificities about the Singapore case, I think, that are important to talk about. But broadly speaking, I think this scholarship has sort of pointed this out. And so across the last couple of decades, the level of inequality has really, become very, very high, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth. And this has also been coupled by a real kind of sort of a very, very, in some cases, sort of a reduced social safety net. In our case, sort of a persistence of a very modest social safety net. And that's an important kind of backdrop, I think, to understanding how that translates to the way people think about work and the centrality of work and the centrality of money, right, that comes from work income. And I'm saying all this as a way to say that all of those things are really important for shaping why people manage work and work-life balance or parenting in the way they do. That backdrop really shapes both their experience of their work and their lives in the now, but also really shapes their imagination of what they're preparing their children for in the future, right? And so the way I want to talk about inequality, or the way I talk about inequality in this book, tries to go beyond thinking about inequality just as, well, different classes of people and different classes of parents have different resources for parenting. That is still true and important to pay attention to. But one of the big things I'm trying to explore through the writing of this book is how we can think about inequality's broader effects on everyone in society. And so here, that's where I talk about how these notions around the importance of market activity, these notions around precarity, and the high stakes of reduced social mobility, that all of these things underpin the way people think about their children, yeah, both in the everyday but also in the future. And so in that way, what I found when I talked to parents across class lines is that even parents who, when you look at what they have materially in the now, right, it doesn't seem like objectively they should necessarily be worried, but they are. They are, because they are also sort of feeling this sense that, this is a very dog-eat-dog world. there is no free lunch, and we just have to make sure we do all we can to ensure that our kids can survive in the future. Yeah, people in the middle income feel also very strongly this fear of falling, right? This fear of downward social mobility. Precisely because inequality is high, even a little bit of downward social mobility feels to them like that would have very big material consequences, right? And so the book is called Unease because that is the thread that in some ways goes through all the different classes, yeah? That the unease may be slightly different, across class lines, but that's the thing that's very palpable across class lines. That is somewhat counterintuitive, somewhat surprising. And I guess I tried to do this because I feel like in my last book, one of the things I wanted to do was to say we should all be paying attention to this problem of inequality. And I feel like I didn't fully succeed in that because there's a way in which that book still feels to some readers as that's about poverty and that's about small group of people. And so this is my my further attempt, I think, to try to explore a little bit more, how inequality is harmful to everybody. And there's a part of in some ways, I hope more scholars will also look more closely, as I think your work and your organization's work does, at what this costs children, right? And that's something that I don't do very much in my book, but I think it's also worth, I hope there are many different threads that other people can pick up on to do more work on, to think about what inequality costs us as a society, yeah? And children and childhood certainly is one rich area that I think there's a lot more that we can say.
I think this idea of like how this neoliberal capitalistic setup that we have in Singapore is in some ways antithetical to families and children. I think that idea was in my head, but I think your book really helped me bring it all together in a way. Because children and families actually require a lot of time and space, both literally and figuratively, right? From their caregivers, their parents, from the government. The parks and the playgrounds don't just appear. Someone has to make a choice that instead of a mall, I am going to leave this as a football field that kids can access. And so family and children are always constantly competing with paid and for-profit activity, whether it's a parent making a trade-off of how to spend time, or it's the government making a trade-off. Children and families are at the receiving end of that trade-off. So at least for EveryChild.SG, I think one of the things that's crystallized is that, we started talking about the education system initially. But as we've had more conversations and we've listened to more reactions from society, from government, I think we've come to the conclusion that we actually need some sort of a policy bubble around families and children. It has to be a considered decision to protect families and children from this uncompromising and almost incessant pressure from the reality and of the economics around us. So one of the things we've actually started asking for at EveryChild.SG is to make child well-being a national priority. So the same way, like I think the cabinet has 4 or 5 main priorities that they constantly list. I think you would all be able to guess. It's stuff like aging, jobs, AI. We want child well-being on that list. We also want like a dedicated minister for children. And the reason we're making this case is that we feel like unless someone is like, fully responsible for the outcomes of family and children, it's not going to happen when it's divided between multiple ministries. Someone needs to really look at holistic child development, children from 0 to 21, under one setup, one ministry, bring all the policies and KPIs in alignment. Do we really need to stack rank children at 12, for example? Bring the resources for support and services into alignment. If you've spoken to any parent of a child with learning needs, you would have heard how hard it is, right from getting diagnosis through the public system, through to getting intervention from the public system. Setting evidence-based standards in how we care for and interact with children. Again, you know, like recently MOE decided that they would publicize that, you know, caning is one of the responses that can be considered for very serious bullying cases. On the other hand, MSF will not let you foster or adopt a child if you say you will use corporal punishment. So, same government, completely different standards, and only one of them is evidence-based. I'll let you guess which one. So, like, if you're able to spark this dedicated focus, I feel like on children and families in a more holistic way, I think we can make parenting easier, we can make childhood easier, and hopefully boost our TFR. It won't go back to 2.0, but it definitely can come up from 0.87. I think Singaporeans still believe in family. I think that came out a lot in your interviews as well. We want to have families still, but we just need a bit of help to make the system work for us. Maybe the last thing I'd like to come back to is a point that struck me in your book about how, as a society, we are conformist, yet we lack solidarity. So we seem to be doing the same thing, but we can't sort of do something together. And this is because all this competition that we're under has kind of disconnected us, and it's each for his own, even as we face largely the same challenges. This was something I felt when I started EveryChild.SG. I would talk to any upper middle class parent who was willing to talk to me when I started, and they would entertain me. Some of them would even like completely agree and rant on about the education system for an hour to me, and then when I asked like, how could you help, very few were willing to stick their neck out and do something about it. It helps now, this book has given me an explanation of why, that it's the anxiety and self-preservation drive in our society rather than just plain selfishness or apathy. On the other hand, it leaves me with this question. Does this tendency mean that as a society we will struggle to face serious challenges as they emerge? Does it mean we have, like, our underlying resilience is low? Yeah, I was hoping to hear from you on that.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing the sort of the vision that EveryChild.SG has, I think, for childhood and for families. Does this mean we're not resilient? I mean, I think the book sort of, as I said earlier, the book sort of goes toward a pretty, maybe more audacious kind of direction toward the second half, you know, from work and parenting to really thinking broadly about our culture and our values. And I think that is because I do think that it is a case study in some ways, or it's one area of social life we can look at in the Singapore context that tells us more broadly about Singapore culture, but it's not necessarily the only way to have led to this. And I feel like, you know, from reading other people's work in the Singapore context, whether it's academics or artists or journalists, I feel we actually have a lot of convergence in terms of our concerns about Singapore society and what kinds of values we embody and what kinds of values are undermined because we don't embody them often enough. Yeah, and so I suppose I feel both like that there is promise in our society, but also that we have a lot of work to do. That I think that there are, you know, quite a number of people who see that we have these problems and that it is problematic that we constantly are in competition with one another and that we tend to see each other in those terms. It is a problem that we often construct problems as zero-sum games. It is a problem that we tend to put a great deal, or often we value people based on their educational credentials or their jobs or the amount of money they have. So I think that there are, in some ways, you know, some people, people in different disciplines, people in different areas of sort of this knowledge production ecosystem who are talking about these issues. And I hope certainly that that is one of the ways in which we can begin to construct alternative ways to be, right? That it is important to look closely at who we are, to think about how it is we've come to be that, in order to figure out how we want to be different, or what we want how our society should be. Earlier we had, I talked quite a bit about, we talked quite a bit about the orthodoxy around neoliberal capitalism. Well, now we're living in a world order where actually that's falling apart, or that's breaking apart. But the replacement of that, or the alternative to that, is not necessarily more pro-social and more towards social justice and more democratic, right? And in fact, it seems like it's getting further and further away from democratic values, from values around social justice. So I think we have a lot of work to do in some ways in sort of occupying this discursive space and trying to, put ourselves into this discursive space to create sort of a pro-social idea of what the alternative is. That is about how do the institutions we have, how do they do better so that they can create more enabling conditions for everybody. It's not about taking that apart and burning that to the ground, right? How do we build a society that recognizes more people's voices and more diverse voices, including, I think, more diverse forms of families, right? So that we can think about the importance of social conditions that enable care more broadly defined, not just parents and children necessarily. That's, of course, an important thing, but I think we should, given that the family has already changed, family forms have already changed, we need to think more broadly about the importance of care and how, since care is a very human, is something all humans need, yeah, that we are cared for, then we give care, that is a crucial part of what human life is, that we should not leave that only to market solutions to resolve. Right, so I think that is the direction that I hope we can collectively sort of be thinking towards. Yeah, even if maybe we don't all agree on the specific terms on which that will come about, or what are the levers we can press in order to get there.
I wonder if you have anything to share about how maybe your future plans, you hope to address some of these challenges that you've been sharing about.
So, I mean, I think that apart from, from time to time publishing things, right? Because publications are in some ways few and far between. Most years I don't have a book, right? I think of my work, I find my work most meaningful when I can think about it as contributing to a larger knowledge ecosystem. And that means often, to echo what Sudhir was saying earlier, platforming others or sort of making space for others, right? To do work that enriches the public discourse. So a big part of what I've done in the last couple of years, well, a few things. One is Academia.SG, which maybe some of you know, but in case you don't know, it's kind of a collective of academics who are trying to create more space for Singapore scholarship to meet the public. Yeah, and that's one thing that I think is important, to create more of these connections between scholars and the broader public, and also to create more space for junior scholars, people who are aspiring to be scholars, yeah, to enter this space, right? Last year, I started work on building this center, the Center for the Study of Social Inequality. And through that center, again, what I'm trying to do is to create more space for people who are working on inequality from different disciplines to come together, so that we can learn more from one another, we can amplify each other's work. Again, hopefully create more space for younger scholars to find their space and their voice, in this. So I think that is part of the work, is to see how I can contribute to also enabling other people's work. I've also been working on a project over the last couple of years on minimum income standards. Yeah. And that work is about trying to establish a baseline to say these are the basic standards of living in Singapore today and no one should fall below them. And with that work, we try to establish very concrete household budgets, right? With numbers, income levels that we can say these are the levels no one should fall below. And that can also be a way of championing things like living wage campaigns. So with that research, again, I'm hoping we can, you know, for people who are really interested in inequality in various ways, whether it's in the research world or in social service sector, that people can find that work useful for their own work. So that work, we are actually starting another round, a fresh round of research very soon, this Friday, in fact.
Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.